All right, welcome to our Valley Talk tonight, Empowering Philadelphia's Parks with Alex Doty. Before we get started, I'd like to let folks on Zoom know that if you don't want to appear on the recording, you can turn off your camera. Also, for the guests on Zoom, you'll find in the chat a link to drop your questions into a Smartsheet form, and we will be fielding questions to Alex after you're done talking. So before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Prentice Smith. Prentice Smith and Company has provided performance-driven, environmentally and socially responsible investments since 1982. They believe that rewarding positive environmental and social change with investment capital that can amplify that change. I read that very awkwardly. I apologize. Find out more at prenticesmith.com. And I'm very grateful to have a representative of Prentice Smith, FOW's board member, Ethan Burchard, here tonight. And I'd like to welcome Ethan to come on up.
Hi there.
Thanks, Ruffian.
We're going to be very close buddies.
Yes, good buddies. Well, I'm going to leave you alone after I formally introduce you. So thanks, Ruffian, for the introduction. My name is Ethan Burchard, and I am on the FOW board and also work with Prentice Smith and Company, who's sponsoring the event. And Alex, want to welcome you and thank you for being here. And just say briefly, Alex Doty is the executive director of the Parks and Rec Heroes Fund and has spent 2 decades advocating for great public space in Philadelphia, from circuit trails and bike lanes to fighting for funding for Parks and Rec. Alex loves the Phillies, canal boats, and canobles. Did you mean the canal and canoble? That works really well.
Yeah, alliterative, yeah.
So thanks again, Alex. Looking forward to it.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. All right, so I have a Friends of the Wissahickon, founded in 1924. And I'll just say, Ruffian kicks ass. And so, you know, support Friends of the Wissahickon. Let's be friends. I agree. Let's be friends. And thanks to Prentice Smith. Thanks for the introduction. And I appreciate the invitation. And what do y'all think of that headshot? I don't know.
Very clear.
Yeah. But what I want to start off with is what I want to leave everybody with, right? So I'm here talking about how it is that my job is to fight for funding for Parks and Rec. And I am the executive director of the Parks and Rec Heroes Fund, which is formerly the Philadelphia Parks Alliance. And that's what we do. We fight for funding for Parks and Rec. And so I'm going to share a lot of information about that, but just the thing to know is that if you run into a mayoral candidate in the wild, the thing that you ask them is, what are you going to do for Parks and Rec, right? How do we increase funding for Parks and Rec? And if you can think of better questions to ask about Parks and Rec, go for it. But that's one you can always just pull out of your pocket, right? We've been working for the last 2 years on our Wreck It Philly campaign. And in the Wreck It Philly campaign, we have tried to boil down what it is that we want the next mayor and city council to do for Parks and Rec. And we want to have every site, all 300 of the sites in the system, to be safe and clean. We want to have more recreation programming, and we want to grow the urban forest. So those are the 3 things that I'm going to be talking about today. Why do we have such struggles within our Parks and Rec system? It's because we don't pay to maintain our Parks and Rec system. And I love that our current mayor has invested money in rebuild and in fixing much of the capital or infrastructure side of Parks and Rec. But the operations money really hasn't budged, right? So we know that there's 2 parts to how the city budget works. We've got operations. That's where all of the day-to-day stuff, that's where all the staffing is paid out of, and capital, that's where we take care of our buildings and long-term projects. So in Philadelphia, we spend $50 per person on Parks and Rec operations. In Chicago, they spend $177 per person. Now you might say, well, Chicago, you know, do they have the highest poverty rate of any big city in the United States? No. Philadelphia has a higher poverty rate. We have some pretty profound challenges. Well, Atlanta has a similar poverty rate to the city of Philadelphia, and they spend $176 per person on Parks and Rec operations. And not to throw any shade on any of our closer neighbors, but in Baltimore, they're spending $127 per person. And I don't think there's any way in which we could say Baltimore is somehow is thriving more than the city of Philadelphia. And Newark, New Jersey is spending half again as much, $73 per person. All of this is happening while we also know that there is tremendous public support for supporting Parks and Rec in the budget. So the mayor has done a community engagement process around the budget every year, and they've been getting better and better at that each year. So 3 years ago, they did a survey. When they went ahead and looked at the results of the survey, what they found is that they were not getting responses from a representative sample of the city. So they moved to more of a focus group based effort and paid people to come in and really did get much more of a snapshot of the entire city. And in that process, which took place for 2 years ago, the 4 top priorities for the citizens of Philadelphia were public safety, racial equity, streets and sanitation, public spaces and parks. And in fact, when you look at that picture, Parks and Rec really has a spot in all of those issues, right? And to me, that's one of the things that I think it's important for us to be talking about with the next mayor, is that when you say, I think I'm getting ahead of myself, but right, so here's the $125 per person that's spent by Baltimore. And if you go, we have some posters up here. You can also go to Parks and Rec Heroes, parksrecheroes.org/RecItPhilly. Just go to the main page. There's a spot there, and you can see this map, which really lets you sort of think about what the other cities are. What we are is on par with Detroit, right? That's the city that's spending $55, still more than our 50, 10% more than we're spending, right? So this hurts us all, but the pain is not shared equally. Now that's both a problem and an opportunity, because what we need in order to make in order to build support for Parks and Rec, we need a broad coalition. And the fact that every site in the system is underfunded means that the mayor can make a difference in literally every neighborhood and every one of the 300 sites of Parks and Rec. But bringing sites up to the minimum standard that we should get to is going to have an outsized impact on the neighborhoods that need it most, and the neighborhoods that have historically been underfunded within Parks and Rec. Right, so I'm often out there having conversations with different park systems, and then they'll say something like, well, Wissahickon, they have plenty of money. And it's like, well, they might be getting more than you are, but they don't have enough, right, Ruffian? You're not turning money back. Yeah, but I think that starts to, that is a travesty. But within the travesty is also this kind of opportunity that we can build a broad coalition. And the message to the mayor is, you can be transformative by investing in operations, which is sometimes a difficult thing to try and sell, right? So that's kind of where our work is. But when we're talking about growing the urban forest, what you can see, and the Philadelphia Tree Plan lays this out very well, which is that where we have low tree canopy, maps on top of the redlining districts that were established for the city of Philadelphia, right? You can see those hot spots lining up together. And when the Parks and Rec did an analysis of where their programs are, they identified program deserts across the city, in part because we had a park system, Fairmount Park Commission, and we had a recreation department. And a decade ago, those two merged. But today, there is still not one single program staff person at Parks and Rec who works in a park. They all work at rec sites. Now, when you walk up to a site, there's a rec site across the street from my house. It's a big park. right? I mean, just this thing that we have of that's a park and that's a rec site, right? Those are arbitrary and kind of silly definitions, but they're still operative kind of within the department. And what I really like about being an advocate for Parks and Rec is that they're coming up with plans for being able to do something about this, which talks about how is it that the program staff can be creative about trying to provide programming in parks. But if you don't have enough staff, doesn't matter how creative you are in your planning, you're not going to be able to do the work. So here's the transformation that I would like to see the next mayor embrace, which is that every mayor has seen the Parks and Rec budget as a burden to be minimized. The parks people will figure out how to make do with whatever goes there, and then we can also defer stuff. We'll have creative people, organizations, volunteers who will step up. If we can instead say to the next mayor, every Parks and Rec site is an asset for you to achieve broader city goals. So as we're talking to the mayor, we're not talking about what necessarily, I mean, I just asked you to ask the question, what are you going to do for Parks and Rec? But the question that I really want the mayor to be asking is, what can Parks and Rec do for the city? And these larger goals that are overwhelming goals, we know what they're, I mean, we knew what they were going to be a year ago, right? We know what they are now. How do you reduce gun violence? How do you improve education outcomes? How do you bring jobs to neighborhoods? Right? If we can fix those things, then we've transformed the city. And how is it that Parks and Rec can play a role in that? So what we know when we're investing in Parks and Rec, we're investing in safe spaces in every neighborhood. We're investing in more after school time slots. We're investing in more jobs for teens and young adults in their neighborhood. We're increasing racial equity if we can bring every site up to a minimum standard. And while it's not, top of mind in any election campaign, we're building resilience to climate change and preparing our city for the future that is to come. And I think another thing, which is just a real crying need for the city now, which is just we need to prove that our city can provide quality city services to our residents, right? That's what we all deserve, and that's what the city should be able to deliver. And I think that that's a big part of what the next mayor has to work on. It's a real struggle for Parks and Rec to deliver quality city services because there are 408 staff at Parks and Rec who work on the maintenance side. And they are responsible for the 300 plus sites, neighborhood parks, rec centers, and playgrounds within the entire city of Philadelphia system. That system includes over 400 basketball courts. It includes over 200 tennis courts, over 600 athletic fields, 60 community gardens, farms, and orchards, 166 miles of trails, 7 watershed parks covering more than 4,500 acres. It's not 400 people to take care of one of those things. It's 400 people to maintain all of that. And that includes, of course, the 74 pools that we do not manage to be able to open all of them every year because of all of these struggles. But when you're thinking about why isn't this athletic field in better shape? Why isn't this piece, and why is it so important for partners to be taking care of these spaces? It's because they're only able to mow a third as often as what our peer cities would say is the standard. There are, I think, 7 or 8 trash trucks in the entire Parks and Rec system. And I think a lot of people don't know this, but Parks and Rec is responsible for picking up the trash at every one of its sites. And that's not a streets department thing. That's what Parks and Rec does. And they do it with 7 trucks to cover 300 sites. So, no, we can't keep those sites clean because there's not the crews to go and take care of it, no matter how many volunteers you have. And how does this play into inequity? If your community is better organized, your site is going to be better taken care of. There are plenty of low income and under-resourced communities that can organize themselves, but not most of them. And really the quality of that park, particularly if you're going to talk about the kids in that system, we can say this about our education system too. We can say about a number of things, right? But that should not be reliant on what the neighborhood can do around that. And if we've got volunteers that are willing to invest, your time and your effort, I think that you should be doing that to weed flower beds, not to pick up trash, which often includes a whole myriad of things that is no fun for anybody to clean up, let alone a volunteer. So, yeah.
My ignorance, but I don't always remember the trash and trails and everything being this bad as they seem to be coming. Do we have people disappeared? There used to be 500 people used to take care, or before when it was Parks and Rec, was that more people?
So there's a couple of pieces to that, right? So one is that I will say it's 408 budgeted slots for Parks and Rec maintenance, right? And are they at that right now? I don't know what the number is that they're at, but it's probably, it could be that it's 10% or 20% lower than that. I think we've had a degrading in city services across the board, right? I mean, trash pickup is suffering, lots of other things that are suffering within the system. So there are some things that are happening kind of across the city that require new leadership, new thinking about how to do this. And there is some, it is difficult sometimes to try and figure out what Parks had and what Rec had and what that is together, but there have been a lot of cuts there. And there have been cuts in the park system really, with each set of cuts, the system never really recovers. So a lot of people talk about that. The problem with Parks and Rec is actually cuts that are going back to the 70s. But Parks and Rec has not recovered from the 2008 Great Recession cuts. And then it took COVID cuts. The COVID cuts took 2 or 3 years to try and rebound from that. And that is a complete mystery to me, particularly as an advocate, because Parks and Rec was one of the departments that really stepped up in the pandemic. I mean, no, so part of this is I don't know entirely what the answer is, but it's certainly not enough. 400 is not enough. The number they have now is not enough. Just creating more staff slots doesn't. I mean, there has to be accountability and management that goes with increases, right? But it's not. But management and accountability isn't going to do squat for us if you've only got 408 people. Right? That the problem here is not managing those resources. There's not enough. Management can improve that somewhat or can degrade it somewhat, but there's just a basic problem of not enough people. It also extends to programming. So we have 300 sites across the system. We have 271 program staff full-time working for the city of Philadelphia, working for Parks and Rec. So you have beautifully redone rec centers under rebuild, and I don't want to seem ungrateful for that transformation and for those sites. But if they still only have 2 staff in that site, then the community is not getting full use out of the investment that we've made into that space. And to me, even if you've got a crappy site that hasn't been maintained and should be taken better care of, it can be activated if you bring in program staff. You can figure out how to make use of the space. But and so I'm not saying it should be an either or, right? But program staff can make something good out of a bad site. And not enough program staff can't make something out of a beautiful site. So we particularly see this when you're talking about the 74 pools, because recruiting for pools is actually about building up the teen workforce that's working for Parks and Rec, that's growing out of the programming of Parks and Rec, that has relationships with those rec leaders. So one thing is we just cut that under COVID because kind of you had to, right? But that disrupted the whole, when these things were needed most, we had the hardest time being able to provide that service. But you saw Parks and Rec step up in other ways. The only classrooms that were provided to City of Philadelphia school district children in the first year of the pandemic, or in the first 6 or 9 months of the pandemic, were classrooms that were in rec centers, because they opened up what they called virtual learning centers. The kids were attending the remote classes, but they were identified by the public health department or in some other way as saying these kids are not doing well at home. So they need to be in a classroom environment. Teachers were not willing, like just as a whole, I don't want to pick on teachers, I'm the son of 2 teachers, right? Hardworking people, but they were not willing to go into the classroom and do this. The school district wasn't, and teachers are concerned about it. Parks and Rec said, let's open the doors, let's figure out how to do this. And don't think that those rec leaders weren't scared or weren't concerned about all of that, but they stepped up and they did their job. And their reward was to get, as an entire agency, was to get less money, under COVID. So I guess there's a lot of things about the city that I don't understand, but that's a one that, you have really remarkable people who are doing remarkable things within Parks and Rec. And think of all the things that we could unleash if we were actually giving them the support that they need to do that work. Going back to the theme of the pain is not shared equally, when we're talking about the urban forest and when we're talking about our tree canopy, when it's 80 degrees when we're sitting here, it's 102 degrees in parts of Hunting Park. Which is just a difficult thing to get our brains to grasp, right? So, 80 degrees is where you're starting to think it might be warm, right? Oh, maybe, and we have fellow citizens who are sweating out 102 degrees. And it's not, this requires many actions as a solution, but an absolutely essential one is to restore tree canopy in every neighborhood. And one of the things that happens is when you have communities where people are renting, it's much harder. We basically, in terms of street trees, you plant it, you take care of it, right? You're on your own. That's how we treat this in the city of Philadelphia. And that's why the tree canopy looks like it does. So we have to do this in a different way if we want to solve that problem. And we know this isn't going to get better in 10 years, right? That spread, the only way that's going is up, right? So we've created a map on our website that you can go to and look at, when it's 80 degrees, wherever you want to, here, what's the temperature in, in the various different census tracts. I think it's by census tract, maybe it's smaller than that, across the city. So this is all based on the city created a heat vulnerability index a couple of years ago. And so this is where this information is coming from. And that's what the Philadelphia Tree Plan used in order to identify the priority areas within the tree plan. And they've identified, I think it's around 10 priority neighborhoods where we need to be investing in tree canopy. And it's the city that needs to be taking that action, right? We can't just be leaving this up to neighbors. Why don't people trust that the city is going to take care of street trees? Because they don't. There is a 23,500 tree backlog for pruning and removal in the city of Philadelphia. Parks and Rec is, under the letter of the law, if you will, responsible for every street tree in the city of Philadelphia. I think they have 9 arborists. So, this is not a number that's sitting still. This is a number that's going up. And it's a big problem. By the way, these are trees that are from the neighborhood in Hunting Park that gets to 102 degrees. It's a big problem, and it's one we're going to have to figure out how to solve because, Nutter loved planting trees. We've been investing in planting trees over the last 10 years, and we lost tree canopy in the city of Philadelphia. So we're losing this battle. We're losing this fight. And one of the reasons is that when you lose a mature tree and you replace it, you lose a tree, you plant a tree, you've lost. You've lost significant amounts of canopy. The place where we need to maintain canopy is in our mature trees. And those are the ones that we need to save. And so there's all, I really encourage you. I think that it's one of the most, the Philadelphia Tree Plan is one of the most impressive city planning documents that I've come out of the city of Philadelphia in the time that I've been, doing this work in public space for the last 20 years, I think. Just a really, really well done and kind of, I think, heartfelt document that really worked hard on engagement with the community as well. And one of the pieces there is how is it, and there's a whole toolkit of how it is that we get at this. But one of the biggest things is that we've got to build trust with citizens that the city of Philadelphia will take care of its trees. The biggest thing in that is eliminating the tree care backlog. So I've been giving this presentation as we've been thinking about what are the questions that we're going to ask the next mayor. And we've asked the next mayor, or at least I hope so. We've had, I think, 6 of them answered. So so those are the ones I'm rooting for. And we've got answers to those questionnaires. We asked them, I think, 14 questions that ranged from what, Philadelphia is spending $50 per person. Baltimore is spending $125. What number would you like to reach at the end of your first term? You can read the answers there. They're all a little, nobody said $112, right? But part of this was also just trying to introduce into the conversation, into the policy conversation. These are problems that you have to be thinking about. So I'm not sure where we are time-wise or what questions we might have. We can go look at some of the answers that people have given, but I'm also happy to start taking questions. Oh, I made things go away. I don't know. parksrecheroes.org. You can also just if you want to Google Parks and Rec Heroes, that'll also get you there. We have a section on our site called Rec It Philly. And that's where we have these. Oh, thank you. I just put it to sleep.
Oh, okay. Were you done with your presentation?
Well, yes, I'm done with my presentation. Okay. But if we all want to sit here and read a web page,
why don't we just put a next slide up then?
Well, I wanted to show the site.
Oh, well, how?
And then if people had questions about how they had answered, we could go.
We can do questions.
Okay.
No, Alex wanted to show a site.
Well,
this is so fun, letting everyone see
behind the scenes. Yes. Do we have any questions? Have I been speaking loud enough? Okay, good. I should have asked that question a long time ago.
I'm going to check our smart sheet and see if we have any questions from our Zoom people.
Yes.
While you're looking at that, are you engaging with city council?
Sorry.
So yes, but not as candidates in this election, just because it's just too big. So I think the way that we're probably going to end up working with this is that the mayor will be running for re-election 4 years from now, and we'll see whether that's competitive or not. Usually it isn't. And that's probably the time where we're focusing more on city council. But part of elevating this into the mayor's race is percolating back somewhat to city council folks. So we've been engaging with city council over the last 2 or 3 years as each budget cycle comes up. Well, they are, but it's the mayor proposes a budget. City council doesn't change it very much. Now, who knows? We're going to have a whole new city council. Whether they do anything differently, we're going to have a different president. We're going to have different at-large seats. We're going to have a couple of the council seats turn over, the district seats turn over, or they already have turned over. So it'll be very interesting to see kind of what that is and what happens there. And it would be great if we could focus on every one of those races, but so the bandwidth is focusing on the mayor. But it's some kind of answering yes and no, right?
We have a question over here.
How much cooperation is there with DHS?
So there's a lot of cooperation between all of the entities that are working on this. Kind of the role for me and for the the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. One of the things that has been a struggle for the community of Parks and Rec, right? So the agency and these partner groups is that it's hard to be strong advocates. It's hard to have sharp elbows for them when they're looking at the budget, because those partnerships with the city, which are so necessary to be able to make everything work, also make it hard to be a pain in the ass. So my job is to be a pain in the ass,
You're
right?
really
That's
good
kind
at
of
it.
what they've all kind of assigned to me. So there's a lot of, I think that there's a lot of coordination when we're talking about what the needs are. There certainly has been a lot of coordination around the tree plan. And of course, there's no one group that's covering all three of the areas that we said that we're concerned about, right? We want safe and clean sites. We want more recreation programming. We want to grow the urban forest. Those all live in different spaces, but they're all at Parks and Rec. So I think that you're sort of asking, on the one hand, asking a simple answer to that question is yes, there is definitely coordination with PHS, but it's also, what does this coalition look like? What are the roles for everybody? And I've always said this kind of a campaign to me has three parts. People get excited about kind of the sexy part, which is where you go ask the mayoral candidate stuff and they tell you what their promise is. And that's step one, but in many ways, that's the easiest. Then there's the first year after the election, which is transition. And that's where you're trying to figure out how to actualize the promises that were made. And they're promising a lot of things to a lot of different people, and there's not a lot of policy backup to that. There's a couple of candidates that have some exceptions, right? But on the whole, so then that's a chunk of work. And then there's 7 years after that, assuming they get reelected, where you're holding their feet to the fire. But a mayor really, the time when they get to sort of reset things and enact their own agenda, that's in the first year or two. So I think that there's it's an ongoing question about how you move from what we're doing now into that next year, and then what's this look like over the next 7 years, which is also then a lot of the spade work with city council, as you were pointing out. Yeah.
First is, do you think the city has enough money to adequately fund a really robust parks and rec department? And if so, how do you envision the allocation of funds to parks and rec?
It's a great question, and it's a question I'm sure we'll sort of get from the mayor. Here's how I approach that question, right? So I'll give you kind of I'm the advocate answering that question kind of answer, right? Which might be a little bit lawyerly, but it's the job of the mayor to set priorities and to figure out how it is that you're going to pay for the things that the city needs to pay for. And if you start putting me as the advocate in the position of figuring out how I'm going to pay for all those dollars, particularly when we're talking about $50 million a year, right? We're not going to be able to answer those questions. I'm certainly not going to be able to sort of figure it out, or you're going to end up making these kinds of decisions about this or that. Now, will we end up having to have a fight like we did around the soda tax to get a new dedicated funding stream for Parks and Rec? Maybe. It's interesting to hear responses from mayoral candidates who say things like, I remember Rebecca Reinhardt's response to a question like that. I don't remember if that was about Parks and Rec or about transportation, but it was like, when the mayor sets a priority for something, they find the money for it. And so Parks and Rec has never been that. Well, I'm a rebuild, right? So to me, the fight that I'm engaged in more is, how do you convince the mayor that this is the top of their priority list and is addressing the most pressing problems of the city? Then Parks and Rec starts to get paid attention to. If we end up in an argument over here about how we're going to find that extra 5 million, I guess it's a very valid question, right? But in some sense, if I'm trying to answer that, I feel like I've lost. So what we're trying to do is make the case. And what I will say is that, the proof is in the pudding for sure, but the responses from mayoral candidates have been, this is not right. So I mean, that's sort of their job to say that, but it feels real. Now, how is it that you take somebody's one paragraph answer to a question and turn it into the millions of dollars that it takes to implement the tree plan, right? And that's a huge challenge. But I think that we should be focused on, I think it's achievable. I think that there's a lot of things that we've accepted as being just things that Philadelphia can't fix. That as bad as I think the pandemic has been, and as much as it has exacerbated a lot of those problems, I think it's also kind of woken us up to say that we need to solve this. And we're a part of a number of different campaigns as the Parks and Rec Heroes Fund, as part of trying to say, how is it that this is a solution to many different problems? So part of the better mobility agenda that the Bicycle Coalition and AARP have been putting together, the Green Living agenda that Horticultural Society has been leading on. And then one that I'm really impressed with is the Kids campaign, which has been staffed by Children First and Donna Cooper. And just sort of a conversation about education being a profound problem for the city of Philadelphia. But we can also fall into a trap. You can fall into the trap of sort of saying, well, it's not a problem. You can fall into the trap of saying, it's such a big problem, there's no way we could do anything about it. And I think that that campaign is also bringing together a coalition of folks that haven't really pulled together before. And that's both about the ask, but that's also about how it is that you work with the next mayor in terms of solutions. So I know I was saying to Ruffian earlier, how, sort of like this, how are you doing, right? And I feel a little worn through and hopeful. And so sort of holding those two things, that to me, that kind of describes what, maybe it would have been better if the election had been a year or two ago, just in terms of how I think that it's apparent that this administration is worn out. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. I'm worn out, to expect more from the folks that are doing the hard work. I don't know. What did I start with there? I started with, sort of being hopeful. Well, I think I got this two-part in. You got two-part in.
I'm sitting here thinking about what you're saying. And it seems to me it's a very hard sell, very, my opinion, a realistic ask to put Parks and Rec in the same place as safe streets, gun violence, but I see a link, and where I see the link is in the children and in the young people, and in recognizing that if all of these facilities were up and running, were fully staffed, and knew how to engage even the hardest young person who finds guns their only resource, you can make a sell. It'll take time. It will not be an immediate solution. But I can hear people who really believe in parks, and I'm one of them, saying, as long as kids are getting killed on the streets, as long as there's asbestos in the streets, the link there is the kids. They're getting screwed. Excuse my French, but I'm upset. And so I don't know. I'm sure my idea is not new, but I'm wondering what organizations or where can I put my energies? Because that's where I see the solution. Not competing departments, not talking about, because to me it is, we already lost part of the generation because of COVID. We don't know what the impact is. And now we're facing even more. So it's a statement, but it's a question.
Yeah, and I think that's right. So we have a lot of, when you're in the middle of a campaign, there are very simple messages that are made about the biggest problems, because that's how a campaign works. The solution to gun violence, the solution to education, the solution to creating more jobs, there's no silver bullet. Excuse the bullet analogy for ending gun violence, but there's, what that requires is a sustained, multi-layered response. And Parks and Rec is not the response that comes from that let's say you're talking about one of the things within gun violence prevention is trying to identify those who are most likely to offend. They're beyond the reach of Parks and Rec at that point, right? But one is how do you intervene earlier? The other is that there's the piece of what you need to do to stop gun violence, but there's also the kids who are not leaving their house because of gun violence, and they need a safe place to go. And they need caring adults to interact with. And many of them also need a non-school environment to engage in learning. And not formalized learning, but just sort of the learning that you have from play and activities and all of those things. So hopefully, and I am indeed hopeful, I think that you'll see the next mayor have some understanding of that. But what's the arc of that? How well do we win that argument? I mean, part of this is that I don't know what the number is. Let's say there's 100 significant campaign promises that are made, and 30 of them are going to come true. So first job is to be on the list of 100. The second job is to be on the list of 30. So I think that when you're talking about where does that effort go, I think that we don't have an easy way for people to be able to plug in to recreation programming in particular. And it's also not easy to try and figure out how you go from volunteering here to trying to volunteer at a rec center, right? So I also think that that's a part of the conversation that we have to be having with the next Parks and Rec commissioner, which is all tied to one of the things that the Parks and Rec commissioner is doing at least once a week is spending 4 hours trying to figure out how to fix a problem like broken pipes in a particular center, because they have to be creative. First of all, they have to respond to an emergency. Then they've run out of capital money to be able to use money to fix the pipes. They've got to figure out a way that the operations people can try and alleviate that problem, or they've got to move people. So they've got to figure out how they're shifting. There's all these knock-on effects of something breaking. And as long as they're engaged in that, there's no room to think about how do we bring in more volunteers to be able to work on recreation. So, and in the recreation sphere, we haven't really developed those partner nonprofits the way that we have around park stewardship. They're there. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. It's just not an organized system that has a robust nonprofit partner who is supporting Parks and Rec in that. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
So I grew up in the city, and I'm thinking about the two Philadelphias. I grew up in Summerlin, it's a fairly affluent edge of the city kind of place. And so Parks and Rec is an optional kind of thing that if it was open and free, went. But if many people in my community had the option to spend their dollars to get better. So the tool is pretty much one of the most homeless in suburbs that were right there.
Yeah.
Is there a valuation for the economic impact of each of the dollars that we do spend? Because had we not gone to Summerlin Springs, which is in Easterville, we would have stayed in the city, and we would have spent our dinner money in the city. And people I grew up with, maybe would not reflect the city. When I tell them they're the city, they've never been here. They didn't choose to be here. And I'm wondering if a valuation of that sort exists. Or
Ruffian might think that that's a double-edged sword if we tell more people about the Wissahickon, right? But,
I keep telling people about it.
but she regrets it afterwards. That's
there's always been multiple Philadelphia, and I lived in the public school system when that was like for a bus system, and so we paid for those things, even if we didn't have a lot, we had more than others that had that option. And I'm wondering, like now I understand that since I'm really not here, right? Like I'm aware of that. I'm wondering what the valuation is. It feels like an investment in the economics of our communities as well. And we stay here, and we're going to go buy dinner on the way home here in Philadelphia because we were here today, as opposed to at the movies and the meeting. Like it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think what your question makes me think of, and then you can follow up question to make me answer the one you actually asked, but is that, say in the New York City system, They have many fewer rec centers, and the city of New York has fewer pools than the city of Philadelphia. They're better staffed. And I'm not sure about the pools, but on the rec center side, you pay a membership fee to be in that rec center. So what we have decided is that we should be making these free, but useless. So it's unfair to say useless, but free, but under resourced and understaffed, and not appealing to anybody that has some other option. And that you have a lot of concerns about how it is that Parks and Rec might be privatized, but we actually do have a system for privatizing Parks and Rec in Philadelphia, and that is that Parks and Rec offloads management or care for a site to a different partner. And then that partner, right, works hard to try and go get sponsors and to figure out how to charge fees and how to do other things. And there are rec leagues that are charging people money to participate in activities on rec center property. Another thing that's happened with athletic fields is that as we've moved to more and more students into charter schools, many of those charter schools don't have athletic facilities. And so they are taking, they're permitting Parks and Rec space. And as the commissioner says, I love having people use that space, but what you've just done is taken money from the school district of Philadelphia, given it to a charter school, and then offloaded some of those costs over to Parks and Rec. So, what's the collection of, how do we thoughtful about what uses we want to have there, but also how are we charging reasonable fees to people to use those sites and to participate in programs? When I lived in a smaller town in Massachusetts, it's like, yeah, we went and played volleyball at the town rec center, and we paid, I don't know, there was a league fee or there was a $5 a night fee or whatever it was, right? And that was collected there. But that, that was, right, that's the expectation. And so another question along these lines that I ask is, my Planet Fitness is open 24 hours a day. What? I don't go to it in the middle of the night, but just, there's a certain message that you send, and that's certainly their marketing. They're trying to say 24 hours a day, and not to create lots of trouble for our friends at Parks and Rec, but what would it be like if we had a rec center open for 24 hours in the city of Philadelphia? Like what might that experiment bring about? What does it require, right? But also, and does it and one of the things that you have in there is like there's accountability. I'm a member, there's staff there, but
example, we thought Royal Rec when I was growing up was not open. We thought it was closed permanently until one day, somebody walked out and we're like, these are and I wonder the economic impact to the people next to me. I heard it's a better apartment, but I would still people with these amazing houses if they knew that was there, because getting those people on board helps us help the folks in the park. And I just didn't know, I don't know how to tell people that. I don't know how to talk about the economic impact. Sometimes money is and talking money for people that don't really care about the woods or the playgrounds or those things, to be like, this place is a huge economic center for us. This is our asset.
Yeah, I think what I think I've learned over the last couple of years in doing this advocacy is that when we talk about in budget fights, when we're sitting there and talking about this is how many million is needed, it's a very hard thing for people to kind of connect to a reference. Like, is that enough? Is it not enough? What's, this million, that million? So when we're talking about what we should be providing and what the agency needs, that's sort of the shift that we've tried to do, as we're talking about what it is that the agency needs. And I think you brought a great point about rec centers, that they can be, and often most, it's the exception that is not a warm and loving place, but you have to know the code to knock on the door, right? Right. Well, right. And I live, before I started doing this work, I live across the street from the King Sessing Rec Center, but everything that we do goes down to Clark Park because that's a magical place. And when you walk, but I visit rec centers all the time, and when you walk up to them, they are not painted. The doors are closed. Oftentimes they're locked because there's only one staff person in there. who's only letting in the kids for after school activities, or whatever these things are. There's no investment in that welcoming or that community engagement because there's no capacity to do it and there's no tradition to do it. So
I like that word. Do it. I don't know.
And sometimes traditions are built because of necessity, right? I mean, one of the other things that can happen with rec centers is that a particular group, whether it's a family or whether it's sort of thought of as a family, kind of adopts that place and works hard to keep it going. And then they get a sense of ownership over it. And sometimes that's a really positive thing, but sometimes that's this is kind of our space. You're coming in here, like we've worked hard to keep this place going and you want to do something different? Like that's, it's a dual-edged kind of thing.
When I grew up, people paid school taxes. I lived in Philadelphia. And nobody said, I don't have any kids, I'm not paying taxes. Because there was no
Go to a county meeting.
right. And I think that what are considered non-essential falls into this, that there's not a sense of the collective good for the whole. And I think some of it is because we've gotten a little bit too attached to money. And the other is that when my parents were raising us, nobody even thought about it. So yeah, we all went to school, we're going to pay, and that's what it's for the good. And I think that without that, and I think the haves, the have-nots, all those things are just an example of we've lost our way in that sense. And to bring that back from the top down would take an amazing amount of courage and charisma. Amazing. I mean, I'm not saying.
Well, oh God, no.
He's worn out, but hopeful.
Well, to connect some of what you're saying to the point that you were making about what's the return on investment, I think that one of the things that is starting to be a serious part of the conversation is that the costs of not doing, we're starting to realize how high they are. I mean, you can just look this in the basic formula of what it costs to incarcerate a teenager versus what it costs to take care of teenagers, right? I mean, yes, there is a lot to overcome, but I'm hopeful.
That's the work.
Yeah, that's the work. And I think that, certainly what I'm hopeful about is right now, Parks and Rec has arguments within budget meetings about whether they're going to get $2 million. And if that's true for the next mayor, then, I'm moving to Alaska, right? I mean, what we need to be talking about is getting to the number that the system needs. And I think that does bring up, that might eventually bring up some conversation about if you were to do this over again, would you create 300 sites? And we have a problem, I think, that we also need to grow out of, which is that what people get excited about, whether you're an individual or whether you're a city council person or whether you're a mayor, is you want to create something new. And so, what people want to do is add to the system, and we can't take care of the stuff that we have. Operations is not exciting. But it is the place where we're going to win or lose the struggle, if you will, for the soul of the city.
And it's really the operations is really where we need the city budget, because there's capital dollars out there at the state. There's fundraising that can be done for federal dollars for capital projects, but they're not going to pay for staff and they're not going to pay for maintenance. And so we have to be able to do it here in the city.
I thought it was last year we had a budget. We had a budget rally. We had a number of city council people come, including Sherelle Parker. And one of the things that she stood up and said is, I think as city council people, we've been paying too much attention to the capital budget. It's time for us to start thinking about operations. So on the one hand, I've loved hearing, a prominent mayoral candidate, talking in that way now, but also yeah, that's been a problem. City council's got to get out of this habit of, just thinking about what capital is. And we were having a conversation before we came on here, also sort of a question about how does city council act in the best interests of the city as a whole, instead of this kind of 11 mini mayors trying to, enact things within their fiefdom. Yes, sorry, okay. Yeah.
We live near the Jeanette Street entrance to the park. It's pretty heavily used. And so a couple of years ago, somebody dumped some construction debris near the entrance. And there's, just some dirt, stone, and broken glass and stuff. So I sent an email to Dr. Cohen, who's the chief of staff for council. So we can clean this up. So, and he's pretty good guy. I'll contact Park and Rec and don't clean it up. Now, this tree is probably not actually on park property, but it's maybe like 25 feet from the end and not part of the curve. So a while goes by, nothing. And so I went into the private parcel. But he's emptying the trash can at the end. I mentioned to him about stuff. Well, that's not my job. And so, and now, just relatively recently, and the stuff's still there, by the way, it's like 2 years ago, stuff. And now recently somebody's done some broken up concept there, always going to find my name. And it's still there. And so, well, I'm wondering, and you may not have to think of this, if it's not the job of Parks and Rec, and it's not this police department job, whose job is it?
We have a profound short dumping problem in the city of Philadelphia. And that is one of those things where when you look at the math, cleaning up the site costs, like if you could figure out, we need to be doing 2 things. So we are part of a coalition also around short dumping. That's the Zero Waste Philadelphia plan. There are 2 police officers who are in charge of enforcement for short dumping. Short dumping, in other words, illegal dumping, right? So in the entire, there are 2 people in the city of Philadelphia who are in charge of trying to find and punish the people that engage in this. And a lot of it is, it is, I mean, you use the word fly by night. I mean, that's one thing. Another way to look at that is that these are neighborhood folks who are providing a low-cost service to neighborhood people who are trying to fix up houses, which is a thing that we want to have happening. And they're creating neighborhood jobs, and that's a thing that we want to have happening. So why can't we figure out some way for those people to be able to dump for free? In other words,
But not in the park.
Exactly. Go to a center. Does the center need to be open later? Like what are these series of 12 things that you might be able to do in order to take care of that without having this reaction like we need to clamp down on those people, they're doing something wrong. I mean, that's one way to think of it. But if you're thinking about it as this is a local small business person who is fly by night / entrepreneurial, how do you make it so that they are doing things that aren't harming us while they're still being able to provide a low-cost service to people who are trying to fix their houses? But it also has to come with enforcement, right? And that we have a police department that's got however many people in it, but it does, and it used to be that there was a code enforcement unit. And how is it that L&I and Parks and Rec and the police and the streets department are all working together? Never going to happen unless you've got somebody whose job it is to address short dumping, right?
There's also like, who's going to clean it up?
Well, that's right. And so, but I think that is, again, it's like, I mean, you described a great situation. It's not quite Parks and Rec. It's not quite streets. The folks whose job it is to pick up trash are not supposed to pick those things up, because that's not right. I mean, they're supposed to empty the trash can or pick up the trash that's on the side of the road. It's a different task force or a different truck that's sent out to do those cleanups.
I would say just on this particular issue, please take a photo and file a 311 and get a ticket started. And if you want, send it to me and I'll follow up.
Part of the problem is statements. like the problem of short dumping, is that it's not the problem. There are so many deeper issues. Why is a good question to ask. Prevention is a good activity. Who are the stakeholders that need to be engaged in the discussion to figure out why this is happening? And then prevent it. And part of that comes from enforcement. Part of it comes from a culture that won't tolerate it. And part of it, we're talking about community and tradition. You know, in some neighborhoods, you dump a cow. Somebody's gonna come punch you in the face. Right? I mean, they're not gonna tolerate it. It's a different culture. So a lot of times when we're looking at these very, very complex problems, we're not actually asking the right questions. And it's a very difficult task to peel the onion back to root causes and figuring out who the right stakeholders you need to have around the table, have the conversations to come to a new environment, a new culture, where these things, these problems no longer exist. It's very idealistic on the one hand, but it's the only way you're going to get to a solution.
And I think sometimes you can express those, sometimes it's hard to express things in economic terms. Sometimes it's easy to do it in dollar terms. I can't remember what the number is, but each, excuse me, for short dumping, the cost to go clean up one site is $750, right? So if you were to waive the dumping fee for this class of folks, would that cost more than $750? No, right? You know, and then you're paying, you know, and then what are you supporting? You're supporting small business. So how do you try and line up those things so that in the places where that lines up nicely, like it does in short dump? I'll say the one other thing, like, so illegal dumping, that's one thing that's sort of this pervasive piece. I will say the other piece that isn't going to get any attention within a campaign, but I think is essential for the next mayor to address right from the get-go, is that the city's hiring process is broken. And you know, that is, and there's no simple solution to that, but if the next mayor doesn't solve that, they're not going to get anything done.
Huge backlog of positions.
Huge backlog of positions, you know, have we got compensation right? The ability to respond to things, certainly from Parks and Rec or other departments saying the amount of time between when it is that they list something and when they can actually hire people is just this ridiculously long period of time, and people don't stick around, you know, while that's happening. So I think like many things, what you're seeing is that problems that have kind of been manageable for a while are now kind of spiraling out of control. That is a bad news, right? But I do think the opportunity there is that you can start to think about what are some systemic fixes, because the problem's gotten so bad that it's possible to redo, rethink, make changes that would not have been possible necessarily earlier.
Right.
It used to be $200 to your account, what's the name of the guy, the precinct costs? Or you would pay, and that's how you would get a city job. And that's in our way.
Oh, memories.
And I would say that, like, within Parks and Rec, you know, they've worked really hard at trying to define what it is that a rec leader, what qualities a rec leader should, you know, and I think that was a very thoughtful and useful process. And an unintended consequence of that is that if you have to have a college degree in order to be a rec leader, then a lot of the pipeline folks or the neighborhood jobs are then kind of shut out of that. So how do you create those standards and look for those qualities, but also open the door to people in the community? And it's, you know, and I think that's just a learning process for for the city to go through.
Because there were people in the field who were better than. We did this in the early childhood education field in Philadelphia, where there were people working in early childhood who were absolutely top of the line teachers and did not have a college degree. And we were getting folks out of college who really didn't know the nuance, couldn't sit in a circle for 15 minutes. And so what we did is we developed a certificate which gave credit.
Mhm.
I mean, it wasn't a blanket, but you had to demonstrate competency, but you didn't have to be able to write essays or any of that. And it did keep the pipeline.
Mhm.
It got slightly co-opted because the community colleges decided that they should be the ones who gave the certificate. And it was clear to me that it was the income generating deal that had been made way above my pay grade. But we did still maintain it. I think that that's something that should be considered. Maybe they will look at it and say, hey, we can do this.
But they can't do any of it with less money.
And Ruthian's trying to wrap things up, but I'm just going to keep going because I would say that the other, I think another pressing need that we certainly see participating in the kids campaign is that the early childhood education area is woefully understaffed. I think there is an interesting opportunity for Parks and Rec to have perhaps be a part of that solution. But boy, that's another area that needs tending.
We have a last question over here.
Okay.
Other funding sources that foundations are taking, or is it entirely?
For the various activities of Parks and Rec.
I guess what your organization.
So I see opportunities for Parks and Rec to be able to get more money for programming through grants and through sponsorships, so corporate partnerships. But we play a very small role and a small amount of money for that. The Parks and Rec Heroes Fund is, I'm the only full-time staff person. So the focus is on fighting for city funding, because I also think that it'll be interesting to see whether we're able to kind of develop the argument about how does city money unlock private money. If but right now it is extremely difficult to partner with a rec center around recreation programming, because the person who is in charge of those kinds of partnerships is often also the person who's cleaning the bathroom. Right? So they're being asked to be everything at that site. It is also somewhat about the tradition, but the tradition is developed because they're trying to make sure that they're taking care of the space as best they can. So I think there's opportunities.
Okay, because she did it so nicely. One last question.
I have to say that all of this is making me extremely depressed. But I love everything you're saying, and I can give you cite one place where it is working, because we have a Mindy Maslin, the tree lady, and three ladies, whatever. Cooper's Higgins School up here, you may know.
Yeah.
I'm like Philadelphia resident. I was born here, and I never left. God knows why. And I worked in Cooper's Higgins, and we had a blacktop playground. Well, because of all the dedication of the parents and the science teacher and the crazy school nurse, we did all, and a Boy Scout leader and a Girl Scout leader. We now have trees all over. I'm trying to remember how we got the money, but it's still being it's planned, and then each year we dig up more blacktop and we have trees, and so it can be done.
Yes.
Okay, and that wasn't necessarily the point of recreation, but we have environmental people come in and do workshops in the yard and all that kind of stuff.
So I hope that
Let's,
by shining a light on what the problem is, that we're headed towards a solution, right? If we pretend that it's not a problem, or I think what we've often ended up with is saying somehow Park and Rec isn't doing its job, or the other thing that develops is I don't have because somebody else has more, right, within the different sites. And part of the message I try and say is nobody has enough, right? And we need to all join together to say nobody has enough, rather than I'm going to talk to my city council person, try and get this bit more, or just be mad at the Wissahickon, or at Rittenhouse Square or whatever. It's just, I think that, well, I mean, it's depressing and it's hopeful, right? So that's kind of what we live with.
excellent. I like ending with hope. And I hope all of you enjoyed being here. And I also hope that you'll go to the Park and Rec Heroes Fund. And I hope you will support it, because the Friends of the Wissahickon and the Fairmount Park Conservancy and Tucany, Tacony, Frankfurt Watershed Partnership, and Riverfront North, and all the many, many other groups around the city really value the Parks and Rec Heroes Fund for this work, bringing great data, a good champion. So check them out, support if you can, and thank you so much, Alex, for being here.
Thanks for the invite, Archie.